All right, today's meditation. I don't know why I always feel like I need to apologize when we read directly out of the Bible as a meditation. But that is what's going to happen. We're going to do Matthew 25, 14 through 30, and I'll explain more later. I forgot to bring my Bible from home, and this particular one doesn't use the word that I wanted to use, which is talent. They refer to it as bags of money. We'll have that conversation later. So Jesus said in his parable, "It is like a man going abroad who called his servants and put his capital in their hands. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his capacity. Then he left the country. The man who had 5 bags went at once and employed them in business, and made a profit of 5 bags. And the man who had 2 bags made 2. But the man who had been given 1 bag of gold went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. A long time afterwards, their master returned and proceeded to settle accounts with them. The man who had been given the 5 bags of gold came and pronounced the 5 he had made. 'Master,' he said, 'you have left 5 bags with me, and look, I have made 5 more.' 'Well done, my good and trusty servant,' said the master. 'You have proved trustworthy in a small way, and I will now put you in charge of something big. Come and share your master's delight.' The man with 2 bags then came and said, 'Master, you left 2 bags with me, and look, I've made 2 more.' 'Well done, my good and trusty servant,' said the master. 'You have proved trustworthy in a small way, and I will now put you in charge of something big. Come and share in your master's delight.' Then the man who had been given 1 bag came and said, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man. You reap where you have not sown, you gather where you have not scattered. So I was afraid, and I went and hid the gold in the ground. Here it is. You can have what belongs to you.' 'You lazy rascal,' said the master. 'You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered. Then you ought to have put the money in a deposit, and on my return I should have made back the interest. Take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one with 10 bags. For the man who has will always be given more, till he has enough to spare. And the man who has not will forfeit even what he has. Fling the useless servant out into the dark, the place of wailing and grinding." All right. So, you guys all know I go to seminary, and I go to seminary quite a bit, although less this last week. And I have a class in which I'm taking the classes on giving sermons, right? And everybody I go to school with is a Christian, and I'm not much of a Christian. We've discussed that before. But I have to read and watch an awful lot of sermons every week to do the preparations for the class. Okay? I also happen to follow politics. I don't enjoy them, but I follow them. And I've watched, debates, and I've read editorials and the pontification that comes from all those things. And one thing that stood out to me and blended the two in a way that does not usually happen from the pulpit, so I'm going to very carefully dance around the way this works. Let's start with, I am not promoting or supporting anyone for presidency. Okay? But a particular candidate took the opportunity to speak to the University of, what's it called? Liberty University? Okay? And he took that invitation because he wanted to. He felt that it was necessary to talk to people that might be against his own personal message. Okay? Liberty University is a university specifically dedicated to evangelical. There we go. Evangelical education. Okay?
Started by Jerry Falwell.
Jerry Falwell. There we go. So after his speech at the university, he got a lukewarm response at best from the students there. But one of the alumnists from the university wrote what I think of as a sermon. He dictated as an essay, but it was a fantastic piece of work by Jim the Evangelical, that is his web name. And the name of the essay is a biblical argument for this particular candidate. See how I just dodged the whole thing? I read the biblical argument. I really enjoyed it because basically what Jim the Evangelical had to say was that if we as evangelicals are going to follow our own tenets, which means that the Bible is simple and accessible to everyone. The evangelical premise is that there's no deep hidden meaning. We don't have to get into the historicity of the text. Did I say that? Close enough. All right. Wait, I'll tell you how to say it later. We don't need to get into the historicity of the text. What we need to do is focus on the words that are there, and we will be revealed the truth of Jesus Christ. If that is the way that we are going to look at our doctrine, then Jesus had an awful lot to say on feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, and taking care of the poor and the widow. He does not once mention his policy on, say, abortion, or at one time ever mention his feelings about who gets married to whom. Jesus had an awful lot to say on the other subjects. Okay? So, in this text, he said, as evangelicals, if we're going to follow our own tenets, we need to quit bending over backwards to try and interpret Jesus' doctrine as prosperity doctrine, because it takes an awful lot of work to make that happen, especially when you're talking about a guy that kicked over the tables in front of the temple for selling stuff. It's really, really easy, however, to see how we as Christians, using the universal we, as Christians, should be participating in our community to help the poor, feed the hungry, and shelter the homeless. Okay? That was the basis of his essay. Really enjoyed it. Now I knew, after reading the essay, although I thought it was very well reasoned, that there were people who did not believe this interpretation of the Bible. People that were evangelicals that are going to these giant mass churches and being told that the prosperity doctrine is doctrine. So I read an awful lot of blog responses that basically said, I really like that, applaud, good job, I'm an atheist, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Jew, everybody's really happy with the essay, until I got to one guy who finally came out and said, I'm an evangelical, I participate in the community, and although this man's essay is a nice essay, it does not properly represent the evangelical understanding of Christ's charity. Christ's charity says this particular man is supposed to be an individual interaction. I'm supposed to help the people I know, my neighbor, my friend down the street, the guy who knocks on my door, who needs help. It is not my responsibility to send my money off to the government and have the government help the poor and the needy in general. That was his explanation. And then he brought out Mark 25, 14 through 30, in which he says, it is obvious that Jesus is telling us to take money, use the money, and get more money. Okay? That does not sit well with me. And I was really happy to see that immediately after that, there was a response from someone, and a response that I'd never heard before, and then I shopped it around at school afterwards, and I feel really comfortable talking about it now. The person who followed said, Jesus spoke in parables. If you look in Matthew, the verse immediately beforehand, it says, the parable of 10 bags of gold. If you look in Luke, where it is referred to, it is the parable of the master and his slaves. If you look in Mark, it's just one verse, there's nothing referred to it, it's just a verse. But it is a parable. And if every other parable spoken by Jesus is a reference to how we participate in our Christian community and how we build towards the kingdom of God, then we are not actually talking about mustard seeds, right? We are not actually having a conversation about, I don't know, everything from whether or not your seed falls in the road, falls in the dirt, or having conversations about an actual Samaritan on the side of the road. It is a parable so that we can understand how we participate within this emerging Christian community. If every other parable is not talking about exactly what is being used as the metaphor within the parable, then the parable of the talents, the bags of money, is not talking about money. Jesus does not care about your retirement plan. That's all there is to it. Jesus cares about how you interact in a loving Christian community. So, if we change those bags of money into love, it changes the way that parable works. So the master leaves his 3 slaves behind. And the master turns to his first slave and he says, I am giving you 5 counts of my heart. And I'm asking you, when I come back, to spread that love and make it grow. He turns to the second slave and he says, I'm giving you 2 counts of my heart. And I'm asking you to take that love and make it grow. And then he turns to the last slave and I'm giving you 1 count of my heart. And I ask you to take that love and make it grow. Now, when the master comes back, however many months or years later, and he turns to the guy with 5 bags of love, and that man says, I went out in the community with my 5 bags of love, and I grew that community by 5 more bags of love. Turns to the second slave. I went in the community, and I took my 2 bags of love, and I grew those into 2 more bags of love. He turns to the last guy, and he says, I took my love and I buried it. I didn't share it. I was worried that the love you gave me would be destroyed if I brought it out in the open and shared it with others. The harsh statement of that master at the end is a very different interpretation. That slave has created his own darkness. That slave hid his love and didn't share it. And in hiding his love, he's not going to receive love, right? It took me a minute to come to this, and when I chopped it around at the seminary, many people were like, wow, yeah, no, that's a really good point. Parables are parables. Money's not money. Love, emotions, we're all good. You can talk about that from the pulpit. I feel better. But the point here isn't just that we are sharing love. Christ's idea was to expand the kingdom of God on earth. He's not worried about the reward you get in heaven. He has this conversation with his apostles just prior to going and getting indicted and nailed on a cross and dying. He's telling his apostles, the love I've given you needs to be disseminated in the world. And if after I die, you go and hide in a hole and mourn my death and don't share my love, then this whole thing was futile. There was no point. So, where does that put me? Me, who is basically an atheist agnostic. While I believe in the validity of the birth of Christ and his existence, I'm not sure that I feel about the divinity of Christ. Well, I gotta tell you, I'm still pretty happy about the message of disseminating love. Because love, as far as I see it, as an active verb, is compassion. And compassion is recognizing someone empathetically, seeing their emotion, their pain, their sorrow, extending that and acting on it. We as a community do that all the time. That's why I asked you to share your talents today. Because many of you find the easiest way to share your compassion is through things that you love. If I love it, I want to share my love with others. Now, while that might be difficult for a history teacher in junior high school, the rest of us have got a pretty easy path there. So, I read The Biblical Argument by Jim the Evangelical. And then my wife and I, as we do, watched MASH. I really enjoy MASH. And there's a fantastic episode of MASH, the 8th season, in which someone leaves a baby at the door of the swamp, the tent, in which Pierce and Honeycutt and Winchester live. And Winchester's always such a highfalutin guy and very rarely cares, who has empathy for others, but he opened that door, and that baby crying on the porch, he was right there with it, holding it immediately. The entire camp became enthralled with this infant. And they knew, it's a war. We can't keep the kid. What do we do with the kid? So they go to the priest, and the priest's like, well, unfortunately, it is a mixed race baby. And in Korea, historically, they see themselves as a pure strain of humanity. And mixed race children, specifically during the Korean War, were treated very, very badly. Unfortunately, the U.S. government did not have policy to help take those children out of the country and adopt them in the United States. The Korean government didn't have a policy to keep them in orphanages within the Korean government. Most of the children were sent back to the villages where they were born, where they were treated as less than slaves. The girls were usually killed outright, and the boys were treated like servants until their death. Horrible existence. And when the camp finds this out, they're really pretty tore up about it. So they're like, okay, so there's got to be something else we can do. And they go up to generals, and they go down to politicians within Korea, and finally they find that the only acceptable way to help this child is to take it to a monastery that has a window in a wall. And you have to show up to the monastery in the middle of the night, and you put the baby in this revolving door. You turn the door, and you ring a bell. And the monks will come on the other side, and they'll take that baby, and they'll raise that baby, and feed that baby, and help that baby to grow and become a full-grown adult. At which point, that adult will then have an option to stay within the monastery or to move on with their life. Everyone in the camp is really tore up about this. It seems like a really horrible way for a kid to have to go live the rest of their lives with monks. I don't know. The other options didn't seem so much better. After seeing that show, though, I was reminded of a movie that's on Netflix. It's called The Dropbox. The Dropbox is about Pastor Lee Jong-rak, and he lives in Seoul, South Korea. And he runs the Juserein Community Church. 20 years ago, so 2005, he and his wife had a son. Well, it's probably closer to 2002, the movie's a little dated. Had a son, and their son was born with a severe handicap. Basically, his brain did not register his body. He had a huge growth on the side of his face. And when they had their child, they took him to the hospital and they had the growth removed. And their son spent the better part of the first 10 years of his life in the hospital. Pastor Lee sold his home, sold his car, and moved into the hospital with his son and his wife to take care of his son full time. They were not going to do anything to lose their child. Their child was a child of God, and they believed that it would bring some kind of, solace, joy, help into their lives. In the 10 years that they were in the hospital, they discovered that many people abandon their crippled children, handicapped children at the door of the hospital and leave them there because they can't take care of them. Because in the Korean community, it is still a horrible, horrible social blight to be pregnant and not married. Many of the people that leave their children are teenagers who use drugs and alcohol during the course of their pregnancies, too afraid to tell their families that they're pregnant. They give birth in the streets. The death rate, mortality rate for infants born in this situation is in the hundreds a year in South Korea. And so they bring their babies to the hospital. And so Pastor Lee adopted 4 of these children, unable to leave them as they were. And he started his community church. This community church is basically a hospital/orphanage in which they take unwanted babies and they raise them in a life that is affirming and giving. So, Pastor Lee's son, I'm going to screw up his name, Eunju, E-U-H-N-J-E, is still alive. He's never sat upright. He's laid down his entire life. He has to breathe through a tracheal tube. He has to be hand-fed with a dropper every day. And the only thing he can do, well, I'm sure there's quite a few things he can do, but the one that was really impressive in the movie was that when they looked at him, and they said the camera would like to see you smile, you could look at the camera and he'd give a big old grin. Pastor Lee said that the only reason that they adopted the children they adopted was because of the life of their son. That if he had never been born, they would never be part of this mission. The reason the movie is called The Dropbox is because when Pastor Lee began to adopt these children and people found out that he would do this, people began to leave children on his doorstep at all hours of the day and night. And the children that weren't left on his doorstep were being left in alleys and garbage dumps and pipes and bathrooms, exposed to the elements where they died. Quite often, South Korea is a very, very cold climate, and these children were not always born in the summer. Pastor Lee, in an effort to find a way to create an environment where people felt comfortable leaving their children, and at the same time did not feel like they were going to be called out socially, put a Dropbox in the wall of his orphanage that you can open up anytime of day or night, deposit your baby, close the door, and ring a bell. So the movie starts with the bell ringing, and he's now got easily a dozen children who live with him. Children wake up, Daddy, 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 is it a new baby? Did someone bring us a new baby? Did we get a new baby? And Pastor Lee says that every time that bell rings, his heart sinks because he knows what's going to be in that box. He says sometimes the babies still have their umbilical cords, that sometimes the babies come without blankets or notes. But if you go under their outdoor patio, they have every note of every baby strung up like a prayer flag. Hundreds upon hundreds of letters. He saved 350 babies, approximately a year. Each baby is taken to a doctor, given medical attention, given help, and given access to an orphanage and access to a body that can help adopt them. Pastor Lee is taking his talents, and he is increasing them. He's doing it with compassion. He's doing it with the understanding that his place in the world is to shine and to grow that light. So whether you're a big fan of the Bible or not, and whether or not you're a Christian, whether you're a Buddhist who buries your gold in the field and then dies and no one ever gets access to it, or you're the slave to God, slave to Jesus, slave to Allah, who takes your talents and lets them shine. I would like us to remember as we go out in the world that our compassion grows tenfold when we use it. And it shrivels and leaves us in darkness. But we don't.